Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about the history of grammar, and to do this we're utilizing Chapter 9 of Dr. Salatardo's OER textbook named English Grammar Foundations. And today is basically a recap of some of that information as well as an extension to some of the ideas. So be sure to have read the chapter to get a deeper dive on some of the historical aspects that I've chosen to kind of condense in the lecture. So up until this point, you've been working through what is essentially a more traditional approach to grammar, and now we're moving into something quite different. And I want to argue pretty strongly that this second part is actually more important than the first. The fact that most people are not exposed or never exposed to this material is one of the reasons why grammar ends up feeling like such a mess to most people. So before anything else, don't skip the part 2 introduction in the book. So this is right before chapter 9. It's actually doing some really important conceptual work there. Now, the central claim for the rest of the course is going to be this. Grammar is a socio-historical construct. And what that means is that grammar is not some objective system that exists independently of speakers. There's no grammar in the sky to say. Grammar is written by grammarians, and grammarians are just people. And these people live in particular historical moments and in particular societies, and their ideas are shaped by those contexts. So grammar reflects the social forces, the historical developments, and power dynamics that exist with people. It's not neutral and it's definitely not timeless. And I would say this is really important, like to emphasize that I'm emphasizing throughout the lecture. I want you to keep coming back to that idea because every example we look at, whether it's a rule, a category, or a belief about language, these are things that have been developed because of specific social and historical conditions. So let me give you a couple examples. The first comes from sociolinguistics, especially the work of William Labov. One well-established finding is that middle-class speakers are more self-conscious about their grammar than upper-class or lower-class speakers. And one result of that is something called hypercorrection. So, for example, when someone says between you and I, that's actually incorrect. The correct form is between you and me because between requires an object pronoun. So, why do people say between you and I? Well, it's not because they don't know the rule, it's actually the opposite. They know the rule, but they're not sure how to apply it. So, they're over applying it using the I pronoun, even when the pronoun me is correct. So lower class speakers tend to just say you and me consistently. Upper class speakers, for the most part, don't worry about it, whereas middle class speakers try to be careful. And in an effort to try to be careful, they end up overcorrecting and getting it wrong. They talk themselves like out of the correct form because they're afraid of making a mistake. And that's hypercorrection, second guessing yourself into basically being wrong. And this is really a perfect example of the central claim. Grammar behavior is shaped by social class and social pressure. It's not just about rules, it's about how people position themselves socially. So, also, here's what makes hypercorrection like particularly interesting for teachers. It's not the students who don't care about grammar who produce forms like between you and I. It's the students who actually care the most, right? The ones anxious about sounding educated. Labov's research showed that the middle class, people who are like upwardly mobile and acutely aware of being evaluated, overcorrect more aggressively under formal conditions. The upper class speakers tend to not worry about it, and lower class speakers tend to use me consistently. So the middle class, kind of like caught between identities, talks itself out of the correct form. And so as a teacher, that kind of reframes what you're dealing with when a student writes between you and I. You're not dealing with ignorance, you're dealing with anxiety kind of masquerading as a rule. So let's look a little bit at the historical side. You've probably all heard the rule, don't split infinitives, don't split the infinitive. But if you look at Shakespeare, he split infinitives all the time. So was Shakespeare wrong? Of course not. It's just that the rule didn't exist yet. And here's why the rule actually matters beyond just historical, like arbitrary, right? So when you can't split an infinitive, you sometimes can't say what you mean. So consider these three sentences. I have tried to consciously stop worrying about it. I have tried to stop consciously worrying about it. I have tried consciously to stop worrying about it. And those three sentences have meaningfully different readings depending on where consciously lands. If you enforce the no split rule, you lose the first sentence entirely, and the first sentence is often exactly what a speaker intends. So the prescriptive rule doesn't just like this prescriptive rule doesn't just reflect Latin, it actively impoverishes like the expressive range of English. So the rule itself was invented somewhere between the 17th and 18th century, I think in the 17th and further enhanced in the 18th, when some grammarians decided that English should be more like Latin. So in Latin, the infinitive is a single word. So you literally cannot split it. But in English, the infinitive is composed of two words, the word to plus the verb. So you can absolutely put something in between it. So what happened is that a rule from Latin got imposed onto English, even though it doesn't fit the language. And again, this reinforces the main point. Grammar rules are not discovered, they are created, often based on the values and preferences of particular groups at particular times. Um, so let's now connect this to this idea of power and prestige. If someone like Elon Musk makes a grammatical mistake, and I put mistake in quotes, does it really matter? Not much, because his social position kind of protects him, right? But similarly, when Donald Trump tweeted the word, I think they're saying kofefe, I think is how they're pronouncing it. People didn't just ignore it; they analyzed it, joked about it, and they started using it, and it really spread immediately. And so normally language change occurs very slowly. It's like person to person over time. But when something is produced by a highly visible public figure, it really can spread instantly. So again, grammar is not just about rules, it's about social dynamics and visibility and power and prestige. And you can actually see language change happening in real time on social media. So, for example, you might see constructs like, I stayed home because homework. And that doesn't really follow traditional grammar rules, but most people immediately understand what it means. And once enough people start using a form like that, it becomes part of how the language works. So grammar isn't fixed, it's constantly evolving and sometimes very, very quickly. Now, the book talks about owning your language, and that's obviously a metaphor. Nobody owns English, but what it means is being able to explain and justify your language choices historically, socially, and linguistically. So, for example, take the word ain't. People often say ain't isn't a word, but that's simply false, right? It's been used in English for centuries, and it's a perfectly legitimate word in many varieties of English and in many informal contexts. So if someone tells you it's not a word, you can push back, not emotionally, but with some knowledge, right? And that's the key here in language. In language, knowledge gives you authority. Understanding how grammar actually works allows you to challenge incorrect claims about correctness. And let me give you a concrete example of what that might look like. So, in some varieties of English, you might hear a sentence like, he be working late. And that doesn't mean he is working late right now. It actually means something like he usually works late. So that be isn't random. It marks habitual action. It's doing grammatical work, right? So from a linguistic perspective, that's not incorrect. It's a different system with its own rules. And once you understand that, you can start to see how labeling something as wrong is often really about not recognizing a different variety of the language. And this is especially important for speakers of non-standard varieties, who are often told that their language is wrong or bad. Linguistically, that's just not true. All varieties of a language are equally capable of expressing meaning. So part of what we're doing in this course is giving you the tools to recognize that, right? And to push back against those assumptions. Now, related to this is the idea of standard English. There is a very common belief that standard English is better than other forms of English, that it's clearer, more logical, or more correct. But from a linguistic perspective, no surprise, we don't find that to be true. So standard English is just one variety of English. That's all it is. When we say standard, we don't mean best, though I think the general population means it by that, right? But as linguists, we don't. When we say standard, we mean the variety that went through a historical process of standardization. And standard English is not more logical. It is not more expressive. It is not more correct. Its main function is really just social. It signals education and status and access to certain institutions. So when people treat standard English as superior, what they're really doing is attaching social value to a particular variety of the language. So, real quick, I want to introduce you to a formal linguistic principle that ties directly to what we just discussed about standard English. And it's one you'll want to keep kind of in your toolkit. It's called the principle of effability. And effability states that anything that can be thought can be expressed in any human language. There are no ideas that exist only in one language and are forever, therefore, closed off to speakers of another language, right? This isn't a philosophical position, let me clarify that. It's an empirical claim that holds up across the world's languages. So the implication for what we've been talking about is significant. It means that no language and no variety of a language is inherently more expressive, more logical, or more capable than any other. So a speaker of African American English or Appalachian English or any non-standard variety can express every thought and nuance that a speaker of standard English can. And the expression might look different. It might take more words or fewer words, but the communicative potential is absolutely the same. So when we say that standard English is clearer or more precise than other varieties, and you will hear this, including from well-meaning colleagues and administrators, right? Affability is your theoretical response to that. The claim the claim isn't linguistic. The claim they're making isn't linguistic. The claim they're making is social. The difference between varieties is not a difference in expressive capacity. It's a difference in prestige. And prestige, as we have established, is about history and power and not really about the language itself. So a useful way to think about it would be like if a CEO says something one way and a student says something another way, which one usually gets labeled as correct, right? And the answer often has less to do with grammar and more to do with who has the social power. So judgments about language are very much often judgments about the people or the speaker. So now we're going to move into the historical development of grammar itself. Grammar as a formal system itself actually originates with the ancient Greeks. And when I say the ancient Greeks, I want to be more specific because this didn't happen all at one time. So the Stoics, writing around the first century AD, were the first to distinguish parts of speech, like in a systematic way, right? About a century later, a grammarian named Apollonius Disculus, and the textbook notes that his name, Disculus, if I'm pronouncing that right, you guys can tell me in the comments, that his name means roughly grouch in Greek, right? So, anyways, this person introduced the word syntax. And then by the 5th century AD, a text called the Techne Grammatic, attributed to Dionysius Thrax, gives us something that looks remarkably like the grammar still taught in schools today. We recognize noun, verbs, articles, pronouns. The point is, this took about 1,000 years, right? These categories didn't exist and then, get discovered automatically, right? They were invented, argued over, refined, and passed down. And the origin story really matters here because when we treat grammatical categories as if they're self-evident facts about language, we forget that someone actually had to come up with them. So moving through this stage very quickly, then the Romans came along and translated Greek grammar into Latin, and they adapted the system, but it wasn't a perfect fit because Greek and Latin are definitely different languages. Then in the Middle Ages, Latin grammar became the model for all grammar teaching. So students learned grammar through Latin, and the definitions were presented in a top-down way. Memorize the rule, then apply it. During the Renaissance, when people started writing grammars for languages like English, they used Latin as the model because that's what they had been trained in. And this is where many of the problems begin, right? You're taking a system designed for one language and applying it to a completely different one. And that leads to the mismatches and the inconsistencies we see today. The central medieval grammar textbook was called the Donatus, and it was written by the Roman grammarian Aelius Donatus in the 4th century. It was so universally used that for a period, the word donat became a common noun in the English language, meaning simply a book. Because when you went to school, the Donatus was the book, right? Then the first English grammar, written by Bolliger in the late 16th century, borrowed directly from the Donatus framework and applied it whole scale to English, right? So a language that works very differently from Latin. And that mismatch is not incidental. It's foundational to why so much traditional English grammar terminology feels wrong because it was designed for a different language. In fact, one of the reasons English grammar feels so confusing is that the terminology doesn't always fit the language. So, for example, we talk about the future tense in English, but English doesn't actually have a future tense in the same way that languages like Latin do. Instead, English uses molded verbs like will or going to basically indicate future aspect, right? So similarly, we talk about past participles and present participles, even though participles themselves don't really have tense. So a lot of the terminology we use is inherited from Latin, even when it doesn't quite make sense for English. And again, this reflects socio-historical nature, the socio-historical nature of grammar. The system we use today is the result of layers of adaptation over time. So let's now talk about standardization. We talked about this kind of a minute ago, but at one point, English wasn't a single unified language. There were many different regional varieties that could differ like quite a bit from each other. So the question becomes, how did one variety become standard? And the answer is not that it was better, wasn't established as standard because it was the better variety. It was that it was associated with power. So the dialect that became standard English was the one spoken in and around London, and it gained prominence for several reasons. It was geographically centered. It was used in government and legal institutions. It was associated with universities like Oxford and Cambridge, and it had economic prestige because London was becoming like a major center of trade. So standardization is not about linguistic superiority, it's about historical circumstances and social power. Let's slow down on standardization for a moment because the mechanism matters and it tends to surprise people. William Caxton set up the first English printing press in 1476, and he actually wrote a well-known letter complaining that there were no consistent spellings in English. So different regions spelled the same words completely different from other regions, which created really a logistical nightmare if you were trying to produce and sell books at scale. So there was enormous commercial pressure to just pick a form and stick with it. And that's the crucial point. The written standard was not established because someone determined that one dialect, one variety was linguistically superior. It was established because printers needed to move product. Commerce, business drove standardization in this case, not linguistic knowledge, not grammatical correctness, just business. And the consequences compounded. So, like once spelling was fixed in print, dictionaries followed. Johnson's dictionary in 1755, and then we had Webster's first edition in 1806. Each one further like codified the standard, and each one contributed to the impression that there was one correct English that had always existed, and that everyone had simply been failing to follow it, right? But that impression is a construct. The standard is recent, it's narrow in origin, and it was built primarily to serve the needs of book trade. So I want you to sit with that for a moment because it matters for how we think about our students. When a student feels inadequate about their spelling or their grammar, they're often measuring themselves against a standard that was essentially set by 15th century publishers trying to sell books. It's insane. That is a very different story than the one most of us were ever told growing up. Now, we can actually explain one of the most persistently frustrating features of English, the spelling, and it turns out the explanation is entirely historical. So between roughly, I think it's 1400 to 1700, All the long vowels of English shifted in a systematic chain reaction. Linguists call this the Great Vowel Shift. The vowel that had been pronounced like ah moved towards and a moved towards and e moved towards I. It was so they're shifting, right? And if you're familiar with how vowel sounds are produced in our mouth, the shift went from lower to higher vowels, the great vowel shift. It was a massive cascading reorganization of the English vowel system, and it happened gradually over about 3 centuries. So here's the problem. By the time the shift was well underway, Caxton had already standardized English spelling in print. And the spelling froze, but the pronunciation kept moving. So now we have a written system that records how English used to sound and not how it sounds today. And so the spelling is essentially a fossil record of the original sound system. That's where the word bite has an I in it, even though it's pronounced with the vowel in the word I as an eyeball. Because when the spelling was standardized, the letter was still being pronounced as E. The letter stayed, the sound moved on without it. And the real world consequences of this are not trivial, right? Studies have shown that literacy acquisition in English actually plateaus for roughly about 2 years during the period when children are being taught spelling. A plateau that simply does not appear in languages with more transparent spelling systems like Spanish or Finnish. And we are genuinely slowing children's reading development because of a historical accident in the 15th century. And for those of you who will be teaching writing and working with developing readers, this is not just interesting background. This is a live pedagogical issue, and understanding its origins changes how you think about it. Now, in the 18th century, we see the rise of prescriptivism. And prescriptivism is the idea that there is a correct way to use language and that people should follow those rules. But here's the important part. Prescriptivism is not just about language, it's about ideology. Prescriptive grammarians didn't just say that certain forms were incorrect, they often described them as impure, morally wrong, or corrupt. So what happens is that language becomes a way of judging people. Non-standard forms become associated with being uneducated or lower class or even inferior. And when we talk about correct grammar, we have to recognize that we're not just talking about language anymore. We're talking about social judgments and power structures. So prescriptivism emerged in the 18th century at the intersection of kind of three forces. First, there was real commercial pressure to standardize the language. So printers, booksellers, and the growing literate middle class all needed a common written form. Second, there was a market. The rising middle class was anxious about social mobility and willing to pay for books that told them how educated people spoke. And then third, there were intellectuals, so priests and writers, men of letters, who knew Latin and who genuinely believed English should be more like Latin. The grammarians who wrote prescriptive rules in this period, figures like Robert Louth, Lindley Murray, were not linguists in a scientific sense. They were, in many cases, making up rules um, based on personal preference and things like Latin analogy or their own moral intuition, their own internal sense on it. Louth, I might be saying that name wrong. You can go Google it. For instance, he prohibited ending sentences with prepositions, partly on the grounds that it was inelegant, a stylistic preference that's dressed up as now like grammatical law. The important thing for your students to understand is that prescriptivism is not wrong because it has rules, okay? It's wrong because it presents socially constructed preferences as objective facts about language, and because it uses those preferences as tools of social judgment. So when a student is told their language is incorrect, that is almost never a linguistic judgment, it's a social one. So we need to connect prescriptivism to something larger because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. The 18th and 19th centuries, the period when prescriptive grammar was being codified, when dictionaries were being published, when the English standard was being locked in, are also the period of the British imperial expansion. So by the mid 1800s, England was colonizing India. They were colonizing large parts of Africa, Australia, and beyond, right? It was a great time for England. And a central instrument of colonial administration was language. Colonized people were systematically taught that their own language and dialects were inferior. They were irrational and these dialects, their languages were incapable of expressing sophisticated thought, unsuited for education or governance. And so standard English was framed as the language of civilization, as the language of reason and of progress. And that is what scholars of language called linguistic imperialism, the use of language ideology as a tool of like political and cultural domination. It wasn't a side effect of colonialism, it was part of the machinery. And there's a small detail, but telling detail in the terminology we've already discussed. At some point in the 19th century, what had always been called Anglo-Saxon started being called Old English. That's not a neutral renaming. It constructs a narrative. It's like a story. It's basically like a story of continuous English identity stretching back over 1,000 years, lending historical weight and legitimacy to an empire that needed to justify its reach. The terminology itself is ideological. Now, I guess I also want to be clear here that this history didn't say, or I'm sorry, didn't stay in the 19th century. The ideology still persists today. So it persists in contemporary attitudes towards non-standard dialects. It persists in debates about language policy in schools. It persists in the way we evaluate student writing. And it persists like really in the assumptions that many of our students have already internalized about their own language being somehow wrong or deficient. So recognizing that for what it is, ideology, not linguistics, is a significant part of what this course is trying to do. And let me give you a quick test. I want you to just go with your gut reaction to this sentence. Who did you give the book to? Who did you give the book to? For many of you, that probably sounds completely normal. But some of you might feel like it's wrong and that you're supposed to say, to whom did you give the book? Now, here's the question. Where does that feeling come from? Because in everyday spoken English, almost nobody says, to whom did you give the book, right? That form exists mostly because of prescriptive rules, not because it reflects how people naturally speak. So what you're reacting to isn't grammar, it's training. And many of the rules that prescriptivists promoted were not based on how English actually works. They were based on Latin, on personal preferences, or on the idea that language should be fixed and controlled. Now, one more important concept, especially for teaching, is the distinction between a mistake and an error. A mistake is a performance issue. It's a slip, like a typo or something you say accidentally, and usually you can recognize it and correct it, right? So I've had many mistakes even in recording this, right? An error, on the other hand, is part of your internal system. It's something you consistently produce because as far as you know, it's correct. And this distinction matters because you don't respond to them in the same way. If it's a mistake, you might just point it out. If it's an error, you're dealing with a different system, and that requires a different type of teaching. So we've been building a story of accumulation. Greek categories applied to Latin, Latin applied to English, prescriptivists layering in invented rules on top of all that. And at some point, the science has to show up, right? So let's talk about when it did. So linguistics as a formal science begins to take shape in the early 19th century with historical and comparative linguistics. So scholars working out how languages are related to each other, tracing systematic sound correspondences across language families, and eventually reconstructing Proto-Indo-European, a language that left no written records, but whose existence can be inferred from the evidence left by the descendant languages, right? So it's really remarkable work, but it was still largely a historical enterprise. So the pivotal figure for modern linguistics is Ferdinand de Saussure, whose lectures were published posthumously in 1916 as the course in general linguistics. And so Saussure shifted the field's focus from historical change to synchronic analysis. So studying how language functions as a complete system at a given moment in time. And he introduced a distinction that every linguist since has worked with, the distinction between lang, the abstract system shared by a speech community, and parole, the actual individual utterances people produce. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Chomsky's later distinction between competence and performance is essentially the same idea, reframed with a generative model. So, in the American tradition, the lineage runs from Frank Boas, who insisted on studying languages on their own terms without imposing European categories, then through Leonard Bloomfield, and then to Chomsky, whose generative transformational grammar dominated the field from the 1960s onward, and then whose influence you can see directly in what this textbook and many other modern textbooks teach. So the point I want to land on is that the scientific tradition in linguistics is fundamentally descriptive. It describes what speakers actually do. It does not tell speakers what they should do. Prescriptivism, as we covered, has no standing in scientific linguistics, none at all. What you've been learning in this course, the transformations, the constituent structure, the relationships between active and passive sentences, that is the scientific tradition. So understanding where it came from helps clarify why it looks so different from the grammar you learned in school. It's supposed to. They're doing completely different things. So just to pause for a minute on something that will affect you directly as teachers, the reason grammar instruction looks the way it does in American schools, or mostly you could say doesn't look like anything, is largely traceable to a single conference in 1966 called the Dartmouth Seminar. It was a gathering of English educators, and it effectively signaled a shift away from grammar instruction towards writing as a process. And it was backed up by research from studies that were from like the 1960s and the 1970s that found basically essentially that teaching grammar didn't improve student writing. And that finding got generalized pretty quickly into like basically a near total abandonment of grammar in many curricula. But here's the problem, which the textbook points out. Those studies were testing traditional prescriptive grammar. So they were testing the old Latin-based memorize the rule approach. And one of the researchers actually noted explicitly that those results don't tell us anything about whether teaching modern descriptive grammar would work. But really, that nuance got lost. What we were left with, and what many of you probably experienced, is teachers correcting your writing based on what feels right, because they were never taught the meta language themselves. So the research shows this creates like really a vicious cycle, which is students get corrected inconsistently. They can't internalize the reason for the correction, and the distrust of grammar as a subject compounds, right? It's perpetuated. So understanding the history is part of understanding why your future students may already arrive in your classroom feeling like grammar is arbitrary and punitive, because really for many of them, it really is. Now, I've compressed this section significantly from the depth the chapter provides, as well as some of the other historical stuff, so make sure you've checked out the chapter. But I really want to sum it up for you, which is basically what we call English grammar today is really a combination of several layers. Ideas developed by the ancient Greeks, adapted by the Romans, passed down through Latin education, applied immediately and imperfectly to English during the Renaissance, and then shaped by prescriptive rules in the 18th century, that were deeply tied to social class and linguistic necessity. Remember, we talked about the printing press and those things. And that's why grammar feels inconsistent. If you've ever felt like grammar contradicts each other, grammar rules contradict each other, or that they don't quite make sense, that's not a failure on your part. It's really a reflection of the system itself, which has built over centuries, has been built over centuries from different languages, from different goals and different language ideologies. And it's not because it's broken, it's because it reflects a really long, complex history of social and historical forces. And understanding that history is what allows you to make sense of the system and to use it more effectively.